Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for the invitation to join, and thanks as well to Lena for that excellent ground setting exercise and raising some really important and interesting discussions that I'm very looking forward to discussing further going forward. So just as a preliminary point, I'm legal counsel in the Global Fund, but this presentation is done in a strictly personal capacity and is only available on public information. So I just wanted to make sure that that's clear. And previously, I've held a number of academic roles and also was at the Article 19, so have been quite involved in some of these discussions from a more policy / freedom of expression vantage point, which will certainly influence my points today. Perhaps just to start out by sort of situating this discussion around disinformation within the context of the conference today. Of course, when we have policy discussions around how to address sort of online content, there tends to be a conflation of hate speech with disinformation and other types of sort of undesirable content. So I think it's helpful just to take a moment to pick that apart. Um, and if I was going to share slides, but it's not really that important to be honest, because the point is quite basic, which is that with for disinformation, like international human rights law is very clear. The protection around information doesn't require the information to be correct. So it's only the mere fact that information is incorrect or that there's an intention to deceive or even to cause harm is not necessarily going to be the deciding factor. And so when we pick that apart more, we need to sort of look at that chart that Elena shared before and look at, do we meet the threshold tests under one of the relevant provisions under international law? And where I can intersect with the discussion that we've just had around hate speech is in particular on the point around, does the disinformation amount to either incitement under the definition of Article 20 of the ICCPR, where there's, very often there may be disinformation, particularly in the context of elections, for example, where it's aimed at targeting certain minority groups. And so there may be cases where disinformation also meets that threshold test under Article 20. And then secondly, the disinformation may meet the test for being limited under Article 19, which, as we saw before, it provides a more general test for restricting speech. And now, in the context of global public health, what we see is that where there's disinformation that is specifically aimed at impeding access to public health, there can be arguments there, and this is where it becomes tricky, but there can be arguments to restrict it under Article 19(2) of the ICCPR. And of course, we have to look at, the usual test under that requires the restriction to be proportionate and where the aim is to only restrict speech to the minimum that's required. And so we'll go a little bit more about how that's been applied. In particular, the Facebook Oversight Board has given an interesting decision on that point. In terms of looking at the scope of the problem, in the COVID-19 pandemic, it became very clear to anyone for whom it wasn't already obvious that the health and misinformation and disinformation can be serious threats to public health. We often see a distinction between disinformation and misinformation, with disinformation often being defined as where there's this intent to to both spread false information and to cause harm, whereas misinformation is generally understood to lack intent. For me personally, I think that this distinction is often rather unhelpful in practice because, first of all, it can be useful when we're a relatively small group of initial content creators online who may be who tend to be disproportionately spreading false information. And so when we look at that small group of content creators, I think it's relevant to look at this distinction. But in terms of just the spread of disinformation versus misinformation, what we often see is that once you get past that initial group of content creators, um, for when the information is spread, it may or may not be with any intent to cause harm. And so this distinction between disinformation versus misinformation loses its relevance for me personally once you get past that initial layer. But this, I'm very happy to debate that point, because of course there are differences of opinion. Um, so the WHO, WHO has described, the pandemic as an infodemic and positioned it within the sort of overabundance of mis/disinformation. It has noted that there have been significant challenges to the control of the pandemic, uh, especially with respect to introducing and amplifying uncertainty about the importance of efficacy of non-pharmaceutical interventions such as masking and social distancing, as well as safety and efficacy of vaccines. These are challenges that we've seen in other public health interventions, everything from whether, the use of bug nets for controlling malaria to others. Um, I think another element that I would raise here is um, a shift in terms of the spread of misinformation, disinformation, because I think over the last 10 years, those of us who've been interested in content moderation have focused on public social media platforms. We've spent a very large amount of our time looking at Facebook/Meta, and then within it, we've looked at Facebook and Instagram. Um, there's We've of course looked at Twitter, now X. I think now we're starting to see a shift from public facing platforms to more closed messaging systems, and that's gotten some attention, but it's still rather limited. So WhatsApp has there's been some interesting studies that look at the spread of misinformation. I'm just going to going forward, I'm just going to say misinformation to refer to the broad category of false information. Misinformation on closed messaging platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram, because Telegram has this sort of public versus private messaging, which can be a bit difficult. I mean, some of it is just based on access. As researchers, it can be very difficult to get reliable access to closed platforms, particularly encrypted ones. And as an advocate for free expression, we want to protect encryption because it has so many benefits for advocates and human rights defenders. So it's not to put into question the encryption per se, but just to sort of raise this issue where I think we spend a disproportionate amount of time looking at open social media platforms because that's where we had access, and sort of at the detriment to where it is being spread now, particularly in the global south, which for public health is very relevant. So I want to go into a little bit more detail about an interesting study that looked at the prevalence of health misinformation in Sierra Leone, and I can share that afterwards. There are a couple different elements that I find interesting. First of all, our research is disproportionately focused on the global north, in particular the US, and to a lesser and to sort of English-speaking media access within Europe, which has been a real challenge in terms of developing useful policy responses within, not only within the EU but globally. Sierra Leone is still focusing, I think, mostly on English-speaking media, but at least it's looking at the global south and looking at a closed platform here. In this case, is looking at WhatsApp. And the other thing that's interesting is it's looking at debunking, because I think that's something we can look at a bit more detail later. But I think the question, if we're going to look at appropriate responses, is what do we actually do about it, and how can we do it by minimizing regulatory responses? So they looked at this, they surveyed available articles, they identified 3 main themes of misinformation: medical misinformation, vaccine development, and conspiracies. Twitter was the most studied social media platform, followed by Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. That correlates with what I've just said, and focus on industrialized Western countries. And they looked in particular at vaccine hesitancy on social media. Um, and then they went forward to actually attempt to debunk using audio dramas. And their general conclusion was that they can be quite effective. They used a control group and looked at whether or not, essentially trying to use like vernacular language and dramatized forms of sharing correct information, whether that had an effect, and they concluded that it did. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a moment. If I can take a step back and just look at the issue of regulatory responses, because I started to get very deep into the weeds of regulatory versus non-regulatory responses, and I think it's useful to unpack that a little bit. Elena provided very helpful overview in terms of international human rights law. So it's clear that some, like a small percentage of content must be prohibited under international law. That was the top of the pyramid. And we've got a few provisions for that, but one of them is under Article 20 of the ICCPR, but it's quite limited, right? So it's in the context of what we're talking about here for public health, it's not generally going to be relevant. Then we've got that bigger section in the middle that looks at restrictions of under Article 19.3 of the ICCPR. And so just as a quick recap, public order is one of the permitted bases. And I personally think that public health would fall under that. That's a very personal opinion. But I think when we're talking about a global pandemic like COVID, but also, given that now global public health, there's such knock-on effects around public, the lacking access to accurate information on both how maladies are spread and how they can be effectively addressed. I think that you can make the argument that failure to address the dissemination of misinformation could be restricted on the basis of Article 19.2 of the ICCPR. So if we accept the principle that there can be some restrictions of content, the question is then how far do you go, right? Because we've seen a number of legislation that have come out on this, which arguably go farther than what's required under Article 19.2, which raises concerns. And I don't propose to go too far into detail on that. I would leave that for discussion. I think it's very interesting to bring in the group on that point. Where I wanted to go into more detail is on the question of non-regulatory responses. Because there's some interesting studies, and I can share them, that looked at the efficacy of responding either pre-bunking or debunking misinformation, and particularly in the context of public health. And so this, again, is my personal opinion, but I initially was, the initial studies that I saw expressed some hesitation about whether or not either debunking or pre-bunking was effective. I think that there's increasing evidence to show that it can be effective in the right circumstances. And my personal belief is that just pumping out accurate information is not enough. So just having access to correct information is insufficient. And so there's a number of reasons for that. If I'm the average user that's going out to look for it, who's just going onto a social media platform, I'm not necessarily proactively seeking information about vaccines or about public health, except when there's really like a crisis. So what I end up having is that either information is shared to me, so I passively receive it, or I'm sort of like going through my feed and I come across, reels or whatever, like I come across content that has been generated. And if the information that I come across is false and it's catchy, it's captivating, then I think that there's more of a chance that it will have an impact, or if it comes from people in my close networks, in the case of closed messaging platforms, for example, or if I'm in a big group, but I'm sort of increasingly led to find myself in a filter bubble. Conversely, if if simply the public health authority is pushing out information and but they're simply doing public, press releases, the typical public health authorities, then that's not going to have it tends to have a very limited impact, and that's what we've seen in terms like if you look at the numbers of the audience for public health information, it's incredibly low. Um, so what I find interesting about measures such as the debunking exercise that was done in the Sierra Leone study that I just referred to is that they attempted to make the content more engaging. And it's very difficult, and we can go into that also, but it's very difficult to like set out to create viral content on, especially on a debunking topic. It's just not that sexy. But I think these types of studies show that they can have a positive impact. There's also studies that have looked at the impact of debunking on social media users. And again, I think that you need to kind of pick them apart. So you can't just say simply debunking or like just alerting a Facebook user to a study that shows that information is incorrect or like an X user is enough. But these sort of systematic initiatives, they do seem to have an impact. That sort of leads to my last conclusion, which is that it's very tempting to sort of rely on platforms to restrict content at the supply stage, because it's easier. It's a clear choke point. Like if you can limit the output or dissemination of disinformation at the point of production, then it's just easier than trying to do it at the level of the demand side. It's also cheaper because as someone who's been working on these areas for a while, it's very difficult now to get funding for independent media, for fact checkers, for like very early stage interventions. When you look at childhood media literacy and information literacy, and also adult and senior literacy, because that's also quite important. We've seen that some of the people who are most susceptible to public health disinformation are actually the elderly. So if I can just conclude, I think in the context of this discussion that we're having today, it's clear to me from the research that's out there that disinformation in public health is a critical issue. I think the part around the intersection with hate speech is quite small. And what we're instead looking at is a bigger, broader issue. It's a much more complicated problem to address. And so I think the risk when we're having policy or intervention discussions is that if we conflate the two, which often happens, we talk about hate speech and disinformation in the same breath, at the EU in particular, then we sort of risk the nuances of how to address these. And so it can be useful to sort of disentangle them and talk about, okay, how do we address one versus the other? And for disinformation in particular, to really put the emphasis on addressing these, not just the supply side, but also demand side. On that, I will stop and look forward to